All right, let's talk in hypotheticals, or rather, let's take a look into the future, which would be a better way of phrasing things, hopefully, ideally. What if LSU beats Alabama?
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Plus, you can also check us out on YouTube as well. Just search Locked On LSU in the search bar, hit the subscribe button, and you'll get notified as soon as Locked On LSU content drops. Today's edition of Locked On LSU is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, all one word, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, for $20 off of your first purchase. Well, let's get into it because we got a big ball game coming up this weekend. LSU on the road at Bryant-Denny Stadium taking on Alabama, which isn't technically, but kind of feels like the SEC West championship game. I know that Ole Miss currently is ranked higher than LSU in the SEC West standings, just given that Ole Miss has the head-to-head over LSU. But Ole Miss got to play Texas A&M. Ole Miss has got to play Georgia. I think we can all look into a crystal ball here and say that there likely is another SEC loss coming in Ole Miss's future. So I will just say, what I feel like I think this game is. You don't have to think it, but I'll think it. It's the SEC West championship game. So what if LSU beats Alabama? I mean, it's really not that crazy of an idea. I was actually texting with some of my friends who, they love LSU football, but, they're not as dialed in to LSU football as maybe you or I are. And I said, if we beat Alabama, because we're going to the Florida game, I said, if we beat Alabama, if LSU beats Alabama, we'll likely play at 2:30, depending on what Missouri does this next weekend. And they said, well, yeah, but that's a long shot. I was like, no, it's not. It absolutely is not a long shot to say that LSU can beat Alabama. Alabama's only a 3.5-point home favorite. I mean, if you just look at the matchups, LSU's the best offense in the country. Yeah, Alabama's got a pretty darn good defense themselves, but Alabama has some very clear and obvious holes on this team. This is not 2020 Alabama or 2015 Alabama or any championship caliber Alabama team that we have known, where it's just stacked for every single position group, that it seems like there's not a single flaw on the roster or in their play. This is not those Alabama teams. Damn good football team, absolutely, that has found a way to win every single SEC game on their schedule. Just not the same kind of dominant team that we maybe are used to in the past with Nick Saban's coach team. So it's not a crazy hypothetical, but let's just talk about what a win over Alabama opens up. The doors and the opportunities that can remain open with a win over Alabama this weekend. First and foremost, let's just talk about, kind of the initial thoughts here, not looking at a 360-foot view, just looking at what that means, what a win over Alabama means. Well, first of all, you beat Alabama 2 years in a row. And you beat Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium. That doesn't happen very often. I mean, Alabama, before losing to Texas earlier this season at home, Alabama had won 43 consecutive home games. Nick Saban is 103-9 at home in the entirety of his career as the head coach at the University of Alabama. 3 of those losses came in one single year in 2007, in his first year as the head coach at Alabama. So it's not very frequent that teams beat Alabama at home. And it's not very frequent when coaches beat Alabama 2 years in a row. So just that in and of itself makes you feel good about the trajectory of this LSU football program. You have to give huge props to Brian Kelly. 2-0 against Saban at LSU. I mean, there's not a single coach in the SEC that has played Alabama at least twice or more and is undefeated against Alabama. Now, I know, of course, we're just talking hypotheticals. Brian Kelly hasn't done anything yet. But I'm saying if that is the case, that's incredibly impressive. Incredibly impressive. And it also would make me think, okay, Well, LSU was able to do it against Alabama with a depleted secondary, with, in no disrespect to the young guys, the true freshmen, but you're able to beat Alabama with a Jeremiah Hughes and a Javian Toviano and corners that don't have a lot of experience, young corners that aren't tested at this level, that who a lot of their first tests are coming against one of the best teams in the country in Alabama. So that would lead me to believe, okay, well, what more can this LSU team do if and when they gain a little bit of that cornerback depth back? If Zy Alexander gets healthy, if you maybe see a Georgia in the postseason and Mekhi Wingo is healthy enough to come back and assume his role in the defensive line, how much better can that defense look with more veteran pieces and more depth? I mean, sky's the limit if you beat Alabama this weekend. I think it also would prove to me that this offense can carry this team. That, this defense is going to have to make some stops. You're not going to beat Alabama by getting in the same kind of, back and forth shootout that you may have seen against Ole Miss. You can't give up 300 yards and miss tackles. I don't think this Alabama offense is as good as Ole Miss is, nor do I think this Alabama offense is really even near the level that LSU's is at, but still, you got to make tackles. Like, you got to make some sort of stops. You got to get some sort of pressure on the quarterback. So the offense can't do it alone, but the offense is going to have to carry a majority of the weight. So if they're able to beat Alabama this weekend and put up, 500 plus yards like they've been doing all season long, 40 plus points like they've been doing all season long, that will further prove to me that the offense can carry LSU to wherever it wants to go. Winning out the rest of the season, taking down Florida and Texas A&M, getting back to Atlanta, being able to be competitive in Atlanta. I mean, Alabama is one of the best defenses in the country. If the offense can carry this team to a win, I think they'd be able to do it against just about anybody in the country. And of course, beating Alabama means that your hopes to get to Atlanta are still alive. It doesn't guarantee anything, because if you beat Alabama and then lose to Florida or lose to Texas A&M later in the season, like we saw LSU do last year, well, then all of that was really for nothing. Well, then you're just Texas A&M in 2021 that beat Alabama, but ended up going 8-4. So it still keeps your hopes alive. It at least feels like you are still in the driver's seat to contend for an SEC championship game. So let's get into that coming up next. What if LSU wins the SEC West? We'll get into that coming up next. It can be so stressful to try and find tickets to events that you want to go to, whether that's games or theater events or concerts, whatever you might want to attend in an area near you. It can be so stressful to find tickets. Like if you were in line, virtually online, trying to find Taylor Swift tickets, I mean, I cannot even imagine how much sweating you tried to do, but it shouldn't be hard trying to find tickets. Game Time is the fastest and easiest way to buy tickets for all of the events near you. You shouldn't have to worry when you're buying tickets to the next big event. Game Time has got killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. And Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. So I actually used Game Time not too long ago. Some friends and I were going to the LSU Florida game. We were looking at some online third-party ticket sites, and they all had crazy fees, and none of them really showed exactly where our seat was going to be. So I said, let's go to Game Time because it's the best place to buy tickets. You can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And hey, college football season is here. And this season, Locked On is kicking up our coverage with Locked On College Football Kickoff Live. So every Friday, Locked On will go live at 11 a.m. Eastern on every single Locked On College YouTube channel. College Football Kickoff Live will cover playoff implications, the conference rivalry games, and go in-depth like only Locked On can, including insight and analysis from our stable of Locked On College hosts covering their team every single day. So you can find Locked On College Football Kickoff Live every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's 10 a.m. Central, local Baton Rouge time, on any Locked On College YouTube channel, including right here on Locked On LSU. You will not want to miss it. Big time ball game this weekend. LSU taking on Alabama. So we just went over the hypothetical. What if LSU beats Alabama? Well, what if LSU wins the SEC West? Beating Alabama at least opens up the door or keeps that possibility open. If you win the SEC West, that's the assumption that you win out the rest of the season, that you beat Alabama, you beat Florida, and you beat Texas A&M, and of course, Georgia State. Don't want to forget about them. But what if LSU wins the SEC West? So you beat Alabama and Ole Miss. Let's keep Ole Miss in the equation. You know, it's not the craziest idea in the world that Ole Miss could win out. Ole Miss could win the West, but I'm just making the assumption that you take care of your business. Maybe Georgia takes care of a little bit of your business as well. You win out on the rest of your schedule. Well, I think one thing that's massive, I guess two massive things. One thing is Jayden Daniels' Heisman odds are going to skyrocket. Now, the SEC championship game is played 1 week before the Heisman Trophy Ceremony. So the invites are already going to be out. But if there's something that Jayden Daniels does in that game, hypothetically, and probably if LSU gets there, it would be most likely against Georgia. If we're going to assume that they take the SEC East, it would be something that he does in the SEC championship game, that he's just, he has a Heisman moment where he's able to carry the team on his shoulders. And something that we've mentioned so many times on the podcast is whenever LSU wins football games, it's because Jayden Daniels does something miraculous. It's because Jayden Daniels has some sort of Heisman moment where he throws for over 400 yards, or he breaks a rib or bruises a rib and then continues to play, or runs for over 100 yards, something that just not any other quarterback in America can do. So it would be massive for Jayden Daniels' Heisman campaign. Also keeping in mind, if you get to the SEC championship game, you beat Bama, you beat Florida, you beat A&M. That's what's going to have to happen in order for Jayden Daniels to remain in the Heisman conversation. If you lose to Alabama this weekend, I don't know if he's going to get the invite. Now, I staunchly disagree with that. I don't think that wins and losses should necessarily dictate an invitation to New York City. Now, it's just not me being a homer. I said the same thing about Hendon Hooker and Bryce Young last season, where Hendon Hooker and Bryce Young, each of their teams lost 2 games in the regular season, and neither of them got invited to New York City. I think that's stupid. I think that you should be rewarded for your own individual achievements, because it is, in fact, an individual award. But let's say, hypothetically, you get to the SEC championship game, and let's say you play Georgia, you lose to Georgia. Almost like a repeat of what we saw last season. Now, the difference would be you would go 10-2 in the regular season versus 9-3 last year. But you might think, well, if we do the same thing we did last year, well, isn't this program just stagnant? We're just doing the same thing over and over again? I hear where you're coming from. Cut that out. Cut that line of thinking out, because we are way too early in Brian Kelly's tenure to start to get fed up with making the SEC championship game. I mean, it's not like this program has ever, expected to make the SEC championship game every single year. So why all of a sudden would we now be taking it for granted? 1, 2, it's Brian Kelly's second year, and you're getting to the SEC championship game in both years. Again, we're talking in hypotheticals. What more could you ask for from your coach? Of course, you could ask for getting further than maybe you did the year before, but Brian Kelly told you. He literally told us at the beginning of this season, this is not a team that's ready to compete for a national championship. We didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear it. You didn't want to hear it. But that's what he said. And I think we're now seeing that we have to take his word for it, because this is not a championship caliber defense. So don't even get the word stagnant in your vocabulary if LSU has a repeat of this past season. It just means, hey, the offense looked better, the defense looked worse, and you were still able to win a whole lot of football games and be at the top of the most competitive conference in all of college football. I think rather than feeling stagnant or rather than feeling like, oh, we're stuck in this, making it to the SEC championship game and not going any further, I think it should make you feel incredibly excited. Brian Kelly took over a roster in year one that was completely depleted and rid of really any depth, was able to turn that into an SEC West champion. The next year, lost a lot of depth, had to rebuild the secondary yet again via the transfer portal, said that he didn't have quite the depth that he wanted to have. And again, we see that. And he's still able to get to the SEC championship game. Well, with the level that LSU is recruiting, doesn't that make you feel excited and hopeful for what this team can do and how much further this team can advance when they do have the depth that is necessary to win championship games? So look, I get it. I understand the feeling of like, man, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. Get to the SEC championship game, can never get further than that. But it's year two. Okay, let's not act spoiled. Let's temper our expectations. If that's a consistent thing for 3, 4, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, like throughout Brian Kelly's entire tenure, where you're always getting to the SEC championship game and you're always falling short consistently every single year, then we can have that conversation. Year two, far, far, far too early. But this is what I want to get into coming up next, because getting to the SEC championship game, Jayden Daniels' Heisman odds, his Heisman chances, I think, would be secure. I think you have to win out the rest of your season for Jayden Daniels to get an invitation to New York. And if you win out the rest of your season, you likely get to the SEC championship game. But what if you win the SEC championship game? We'll get into that coming up next. I want to tell you about FanDuel. You can score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can get you can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's right. $150 if your team wins. And it's just $5. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time to get in on the action. Plus, the app is super easy to use. That's one of my favorite parts about the FanDuel Sportsbook app, is just how easy it is. Plus, they've got a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, LOCKEDON, and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. So what if LSU beats Alabama? Well, the door remains open for you to get to Atlanta. What if you get to Atlanta? Well, Jayden Daniels' Heisman odds, I think, are not to win it, but to at least get to New York, are pretty secure, and I like his odds to win it. But what if you win the SEC championship game? I think there is if you win the SEC championship game, again, you have to beat Alabama, you have to beat Florida, you have to beat Texas A&M. Ole Miss has to lose to Georgia. You have to get to Atlanta, and then you have to beat Georgia. That's a lot that has to happen, and that's a lot that has to go right and to go your way in order to get there. But we're talking in hypotheticals today. If you win the SEC championship game, I think there's a really good chance that LSU could be the very first, and I guess last two-loss team to get into the 4-team college football playoff. Because remember, the playoff expands next year, 12 teams. So there's going to be 2-loss teams in a 12-team playoff. So under these circumstances, assuming that Georgia wins out the rest of their season, which no Brock Bowers, maybe crazier things could happen, but let's just go ahead and say Georgia wins out. Georgia gets the SEC championship game. You play Georgia in the SEC championship game. You beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. I think the College Football Playoff Committee would have to consider LSU, because LSU would have the best win in the country. Assuming that Georgia wins out until the SEC championship game, you would hand Georgia their first loss in nearly 2 years. You would hand Georgia their first loss since the SEC championship game in 2021, when Alabama beat them and then they faced off again in the national championship game. Georgia won the national championship in 2021. Hands down, the best win in college football. In fact, it wouldn't just be the best win in college football this season, it'd be the best win in college football over the last 2 seasons. So the caveat here too is you wouldn't really be able to put a 2-loss LSU team in over an undefeated Power 5 team. So assuming that Georgia wins out, Florida State wins out, Washington wins out, I'm forgetting somebody else. But if there are 4 undefeated teams, it doesn't, I don't think it would matter if you beat Georgia. And that's just my interpretation of it. The College Football Playoff Committee does weird and crazy things. But you would at least have a really strong case and a really strong resume in order to get in. Especially if Florida State wins out and gets in. Well, the College Football Playoff Committee could look at it and say, well, one of their losses on the schedule came one early in the season, which the College Football Playoff Committee has a tendency to give forgiveness to early season losses, and it'd be to a playoff contender and maybe even the ACC champion. So I don't know. Crazy to think about. But really, overall, my whole point of this, because you might be listening to this and thinking, like, what, like, why are we talking about this right now? Like, we're not close to the SEC championship game. We've got a lot of work to do before you even, consider the SEC championship game. And you would be right. And I acknowledge that. I fully and wholeheartedly acknowledge that you've got 3 really tough and key important games coming up on your schedule that you have to win before we can talk about Atlanta. But all of that to say, and all of this, I believe, shows how important this game is this weekend. It's not important just because it's Alabama. Of course it's Alabama. Of course it's going to be important. But it's what would still lie ahead of you. What doors would be open? What opportunities are still there to seize for this LSU football team if they beat Alabama this weekend? If you don't beat Alabama this weekend, you're not going to the SEC championship game. Jayden Daniels isn't going to win the Heisman Trophy. You have absolutely zero hope for the college football playoff. The hope for the playoff already is like 0.5%. You would have zero shot at the playoff. You've got some of the biggest things and the biggest achievements in college football that are still within your grasp. The SEC championship game, the Heisman Trophy, and the college football playoff. Those things are all still in play, but none of those things matter anymore if you don't beat Alabama this weekend. Everything is still in your reach if you do beat Alabama this weekend. You don't beat Alabama, yeah, maybe New Year's 6 is still on the table. Absolutely. It's just different. It's not the same. Not the same as a Heisman and a trip to Atlanta. So I think we all know every year a game against Alabama is going to be huge. The pomp and circumstance is going to be huge. All the pageantry will be huge. Viewership will be huge. Interest will be huge. But this year, what's on the table for LSU is just bigger than all of that. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. Coming up on tomorrow's edition of Locked On LSU, we'll get into a Mailbag Wednesday, so make sure to get those questions in. You can comment them below on the YouTube page, or you can tweet them in at Caroline Fenton1, my Twitter, or at Locked On LSU. Of course, we'll also have a Locked On crossover with myself and the hosts of Locked On Alabama. So all of that coming up here on the next few days on Locked On LSU.